A factory in Leeds that employed 10,000 people, 9,000 of them women. A canteen that seated 8,000. 30,000 made-to-measure suits stitched every week in a building so important the enemy marked it for bombing. They called it the biggest clothing factory in the world. Then the making stopped. The production floors were carved into warehouse space. The welfare, the dentist, the eye exams, the sunroom disappeared. New owners arrived and extracted £1.2 billion in dividends while the pension fund collapsed. The brands were sold online. The name went for $25 million. And on Hudson Road, the building that once breathed with the rhythm of 9,000 sewing machines is being turned into flats. This is the story of a Lithuanian boy who arrived in Britain at 15 with nothing, built an empire that dressed the nation, and left behind a factory whose workers, the women who made it all, are remembered now only in archives, plaques, and the fading memory of what dignity at work once looked like. Chapter 1. The Boy from Kaunas. The story begins where so many British industrial stories begin, with someone who wasn't British at all. In 1900, a 15-year-old Lithuanian boy stepped off a boat and into a country whose language he couldn't speak. His name was Mesher David Osinski. He'd been born in 1885 near Kaunas into a Jewish community that already knew, with the certainty that comes from lived experience, that Eastern Europe was not going to get safer. The pogroms hadn't finished. They were accelerating. And so families made calculations that no family should have to make, which of their children to send, and where, and with how little. Mesh arrived with almost nothing. No English, no capital, no connections beyond whatever fragile thread of community tied newly landed Jewish immigrants to those who'd come before them. He was 15. He was alone. And he was standing in a country that was, at that precise moment, the most industrialized nation on earth. A place where cloth moved through mills at a pace the rest of the world couldn't match. Where a man with sharp instincts and a willingness to work could, in theory, find a gap in the market and fill it. He wouldn't stay Mesher Osinski for long. The name changed in stages, a common pattern among immigrants navigating a society that rewarded assimilation. By the time he naturalised in 1910, he was Morris Burton. But the shopfront he'd opened 6 years earlier in Chesterfield already carried a grander name, Montague Burton. It was aspirational, it was deliberate, and it told you everything about what this young man understood, instinctively, at 20 years old, about the English relationship between class and clothing. Because clothing, in Edwardian Britain, wasn't simply about warmth or decency. It was a system of signals. A well-cut suit told the world you were respectable. A poorly fitted one told the world you weren't. And the gap between the two, between the bespoke tailoring available to the professional classes and the shapeless, ready-made garments sold to working men, was enormous. The working man couldn't afford a Savile Row suit, but he wanted to look like he could. That was the gap. And Mesher Osinski, now Montague Burton, walked straight into it. His first shop opened in Chesterfield in 1904. He was 19. The concept was deceptively simple. Offer made-to-measure suits at prices working men could afford, and do it at a speed that made the experience feel modern rather than laborious. A customer would be measured in the shop. The order would travel to a central production facility. The suit would come back fitted to the individual, not pulled off a rack, not somebody else's shape, but yours, and it would cost roughly a week's wages. This wasn't charity. It was commercial genius dressed in democratic clothing. Burton had grasped something that his competitors, many of them established firms with decades of experience, had missed. That working men didn't want cheaper clothes. They wanted better clothes, priced within reach. The distinction mattered. Cheaper meant inferior. Better meant dignity. And dignity, Burton intuited, was a market so vast that no single firm had begun to serve it properly. The Chesterfield shop survived. Then it grew. A second premises followed, then a third. Burton was learning the mechanics of retail, how to manage stock, how to read a customer, how to balance the books. But he was also learning something more fundamental. He was learning that the bottleneck wasn't selling suits, it was making them fast enough. Every order that left a Burton shop travelled to wherever the cutting and sewing happened. If that production couldn't keep pace with the orders, the business would choke on its own success. And Burton, who had arrived in England with nothing and built a functioning retail operation by his early 20s, looked at that bottleneck and made the decision that would define his life. He wouldn't just sell suits. He'd make them. And he wouldn't make them in a back room behind the shop. He'd make them at a scale that nobody in the British clothing trade had ever attempted. Chapter 2. Hudson Road, Leeds was already a clothing city when Burton arrived. The wool trade had built fortunes there for centuries. Raw fleece from the Pennine Hills, washed and combed and spun in mills that lined the rivers, then cut and stitched in workshops spread across the East End. Tailoring wasn't new to Leeds. What was new was the idea that tailoring could be industrialised, that the intimate craft of fitting a suit to a human body could be performed not by a man with a tape measure and a lifetime of experience, but by a system, a machine, an organism. Burton chose a site on Hudson Road in the Bermontofts district, a stretch of East Leeds where land was cheap, transport links ran close, and the surrounding terraces housed exactly the kind of workforce he'd need. He began building, and what rose on Hudson Road over the following years wasn't a factory in any ordinary sense. It was a declaration. The numbers, even now, resist easy comprehension. At its peak, the Hudson Road Works employed approximately 10,500 people, 1,000 men, 9,000 women. They produced 30,000 suits every single week, not off the rack, but made to measure, each one cut to an individual customer's dimensions, assembled on production lines that moved cloth through the building with the efficiency of a munitions operation. The flagship of an empire that would eventually stretch to nearly 600 shops across Britain, Hudson Road was described by the European route of industrial heritage as the world's biggest clothing factory. Not one of the biggest. The biggest. But Burton wasn't simply building a production line, he was building a world. The canteen tells you everything. In 1922, when the workforce was still growing, Burton opened an on-site canteen seating 1,000. 6 years later, he replaced it with one seating 4,000. And then, in October 1934, Princess Mary, the Princess Royal, travelled to Leeds to open a canteen that seated 8,000 workers at a single sitting. 8,000. In one room. For one meal. That escalation, 1,000, 4,000, 8,000, isn't catering logistics. It's ideology made physical. Each expansion was Burton's answer to two questions. How big is this place becoming? And what do I owe the people who work here? His answer to the second question was, everything I can manage. The welfare provision at Hudson Road operated on a principle that the British welfare state, still a decade away from its post-war creation, hadn't yet formalised. Burton provided dental examinations on site, eye examinations on site, a doctor permanently stationed in the works, a purpose-built sunroom, a space designed to give workers exposure to simulated sunlight, rooted in the early 20th century medical conviction that light therapy improved health and morale. The Yorkshire Film Archive holds footage produced by Burton himself, promotional films designed to showcase these facilities. The dental chair, the examination room, the rows of workers eating subsidised meals. It was welfare capitalism before the term existed. The idea that a well-fed, well-treated workforce would be a more productive one, and that the cost of care was an investment, not an expense. A Jewish Archives essay on the Leeds factory describes Hudson Road as a complete factory town, and the phrase is precise. Burton hadn't just built a place where suits were made. He'd built a place where lives were organised. Workers didn't merely clock in, stitch and leave. They ate there. They were examined there. They played sport there. Bowling greens, cricket pitches, tennis courts, all within the works boundary. The Leeds Civic Trust's later records of the site explicitly recall these recreational facilities, mapping a landscape designed not just around output, but around the rhythm of a full human day. And at the centre of all of it, women, 9,000 of them. Machinists, pressers, finishers, examiners. The overwhelming majority of the hands that turned cloth into suits belonged to women, In an era when British industrial prestige was coded almost entirely as male, coal, steel, shipbuilding, the heavy industries that dominated the national imagination, Hudson Road was powered by female labour on a scale that quietly challenged every assumption about what an industrial titan looked like. One of those women was Doris Story. She arrived at the Hare Hills factory, part of the wider Burton operation, around 1935 and worked as a machinist until 1948. What makes Doris remarkable, beyond the sheer ordinariness of her working life, is what she did around it. She was an Olympic standard athlete. Her training schedule was built around her shifts at Burton's, not the other way around. The factory came first. The athletics fitted in where it could. Leeds museums and galleries preserved her story as an example of the lives that Hudson Road contained. Not abstract headcount, but real women with ambitions, routines and identities that extended far beyond the sewing machine. Doris's story carries a quieter revelation too. The fact that her athletics had to accommodate her machinist hours, rather than the reverse, tells you something about the economic reality for working women in interwar Leeds. Burton's welfare provisions were genuine and, for their time, extraordinary. But this was still waged labour in a hierarchical system. The women of Hudson Road weren't free agents choosing a progressive employer. They were workers who needed the wage, and the welfare was Burton's side of a bargain, whose other side was relentless, repetitive, highly skilled production at industrial speed. Burton understood that bargain, and he made sure his side of it was visible, not just to the workers, but to the world. Chapter 3. The Tailor of Taste. The shop fronts arrived in waves. 140 Burton shops by 1922, 291 by 1929. And then the number kept climbing. Through the Depression, through the uncertainty of the early 30s, through conditions that killed weaker firms, until, by the time war broke out in 1939, 595 Burton branches stood on British high streets from Aberdeen to Plymouth. Each one looked the same. Not approximately the same, precisely the same. Burton had understood, decades before the franchise model became a business school case study, that uniformity was a form of trust. A customer walking into a Burton shop in Newcastle should see the same fittings, the same layout, the same materials as a customer walking into a Burton shop in Cardiff. The shop fronts themselves became architectural signatures, distinctive Art Deco facades, clean lines, a visual language that said, "This is a serious establishment and you will be treated seriously here." The service scripts reinforced the message. Every customer was to be addressed as Sir, not out of deference, out of strategy. Burton had calculated that a working man addressed as Sir, while being measured for a suit that would fit him properly, would feel, for the duration of that transaction, like a man whose dignity was being recognised. And a man whose dignity was recognised came back. He told his mates. He brought his sons. It was retail psychology before the discipline had a name, and behind every shopfront, feeding every fitting room, supplying every Sir with a suit that matched his measurements, Hudson Road churned. The production system Burton had built was, by the 1930s, operating at a tempo that astonished visitors. The workflow, documented in company films and later catalogued by the Yorkshire Film Archive, began at the receiving department. Cloth arrived in bulk. It was unloaded, weighed, measured for width and length, then examined inch by inch for faults. Any imperfection was flagged, marked and routed around. Nothing substandard was permitted into the cutting room. Burton's obsession with quality wasn't sentimental. It was structural. A suit that disappointed a customer was a customer who didn't return, and the entire model, hundreds of shops, a single colossal factory, depended on return custom. From the receiving department, cloth moved through cutting, assembly, pressing and finishing in a sequence designed to minimise handling time and maximise throughput. The 1950 promotional film Ideals of Industry, described in the BFI player synopsis as a behind-the-scenes look at the Leeds factory, emphasises two things above all: the dexterity of the workers and the sheer, overwhelming scale of the operation. 30,000 suits a week. That's not a number that sits comfortably in the imagination. It means 4,000 suits every working day. It means hundreds of completed garments leaving the finishing department every single hour. It means a production rhythm so relentless that the building itself seemed to breathe with it. Cloth in, suits out, cloth in, suits out, week after week, year after year. And then the war came, and Burton proved the factory could do something else entirely. The exact details of Hudson Road's wartime contribution sit partly in company law and partly in verifiable record. What is documented is that Burton's production capacity was redirected toward military uniforms, a shift from civilian made-to-measure to military standardization that the factory's existing infrastructure could absorb without fundamental redesign. The cutting tables that had shaped worsted for office suits now shaped serge for battle dress. The machinists whose hands had stitched lapels now stitched epaulettes. And the speed, the terrifying, mesmerizing speed of Hudson Road at full capacity, was turned toward a cause that made commercial output feel almost quaint by comparison. A company history records that a map recovered from German archives pinpointed Hudson Road as a Luftwaffe bombing target. Whether this account is embellished or precise, its persistence in the Burton narrative tells you something about how the factory understood itself during those years. Not merely as a commercial operation contributing to the war effort, but as a strategic asset, important enough to attract enemy attention. The Germans, the story says, knew what Hudson Road was. They knew what it could produce. And they wanted it gone. It survived. And at the 1946 Victory Parade, Burton made sure the nation knew what its factory had delivered. The company marched its wartime production record through London as proof of industrial patriotism, a gesture that cemented Burton's status not merely as a successful business, but as a national institution. The tailor of taste had become, for the duration of the conflict, the tailor of the armed forces. And the women of Hudson Road, 9,000 of them, had powered both identities. After the war, the interplay between Burton's commercial ambitions and its workforce needs revealed a tension that would echo, decades later, in very different circumstances. The demand for Burton's suits surged. Demobilized men wanted civilian clothes. The economy was recovering. The shops were busy. And Hudson Road needed more hands than East Leeds could provide. Burton's solution was practical, rapid, and quietly revealing. The company began bussing women in from Castleford and Normanton, mining towns to the southeast of Leeds, where female employment options were limited and the Burton wage looked attractive. A fleet of buses running daily routes carried women from their terraced streets to Hudson Road's gates and back again. It was efficient. It was generous, in a way. The transport was provided, the employment was steady, the welfare facilities awaited. But it was also the first visible sign that the factory's appetite for labour had outgrown its immediate community. The later company history records that Burton then went further, seeking additional female workers from Lancashire's struggling cotton towns. Towns where the textile trade was already contracting, where women who'd spent years in the mills found those mills closing around them. Burton offered an alternative. A different loom, a different cloth, a different city, but the same basic exchange. Your hands, your skill, your hours, in return for a wage and a place in something enormous. It looked like expansion. It looked like strength. A factory so successful it had to reach across county lines to find enough workers. What could be more triumphant? But look again, and the outline of something else is visible. A production model that depended on mobile labour inputs. A factory that couldn't sustain itself from its own catchment. A system whose hunger for hands would, one day, be answered not by buses from Castleford, but by shipping containers from Dhaka. The seeds were there, buried in the very success that made Burton feel invincible. Nobody saw them. Not yet. The war was won. The shops were full. The suits were moving. And Hudson Road, 10,000 workers, 30,000 suits a week, 8,000 seats in the canteen, stood at its absolute summit. Chapter 4. The Floor That Never Stopped. If you'd walked through the gates of Hudson Road on a Monday morning in 1950, past the clock-in stations, through the corridors that smelled of floor polish and machine oil and the faint sweet edge of pressed wool, the first thing you'd have noticed wasn't the noise. It was the movement. The building breathed. Cloth moved through it the way blood moves through a body, arriving raw at one end, transforming as it passed through each department and leaving at the other end as something entirely different. Something with a name on it. Something with a customer waiting. The receiving department was the lungs. Bolts of cloth, worsted, serge, gabardine, tweed, arrived by the lorry load, rolled tight and stacked on pallets that were wheeled into a space designed for one purpose: suspicion. Nothing was trusted. Every bolt was unloaded, weighed, measured for width, and then examined, not glanced at, examined, by women whose hands moved across the fabric surface with the practiced certainty of someone who'd been doing this for years. A slub in the weave, a variation in the dye, a thread pulled loose during transit. Any fault, however small, was marked and the section routed around. Burton's entire model depended on a customer in Sunderland or Swansea receiving a suit that justified the promise made in the shopfront. Quality control wasn't a department. It was a religion. From receiving, the cloth moved to cutting. This was where the individual met the industrial, where a set of measurements taken in a shop in Glasgow or Bristol was translated into a pattern. And that pattern was laid across fabric and cut with a precision that left almost no waste. The cutting room was staffed predominantly by men, one of the few departments where male workers outnumbered female, and the skill involved was specific and unforgiving. A miscut couldn't be undone. The fabric was committed the moment the blade moved. And at the rate Hudson Road operated, 4,000 suits a day, every working day, the cutting room was a place where concentration wasn't optional. It was survival. Then the pieces moved to the machinists, and this was where the factory's true character revealed itself. 9,000 women. Row after row of sewing machines, each one operated by a woman whose hands moved with a speed that visitors, including the filmmakers who produced ideals of industry in 1950, found almost impossible to follow. The dexterity was the product of repetition, refined into something that looked effortless but wasn't. A machinist on a seam might perform the same operation hundreds of times in a single shift, and the difference between a good machinist and an exceptional one was measured in fractions of a second per seam, fractions of a millimetre in stitch placement. Multiply those fractions across 9,000 women and 30,000 suits a week, and you begin to understand why Burton guarded his workforce with welfare provisions that other employers considered extravagant. These women weren't interchangeable. Their skill was the factory's spine. The pressing department came next, industrial irons that hissed with steam, shaping the assembled garments into the silhouette that a customer would recognise as a proper suit. The pressing was physical work, hot work, and the air in that section carried a dense, damp warmth that clung to the skin, a mix of steam and heated wool that anyone who worked there would remember decades later. Then finishing. Buttons attached, buttonholes checked, linings inspected, every completed garment passed through a final examination before it was packaged, labelled, and dispatched to whichever of Burton's hundreds of shops had placed the order. The whole sequence, receiving, cutting, machining, pressing, finishing, dispatch, was a single unbroken current. Nothing waited. Nothing sat idle. The production line didn't pause between stages because pausing meant the shops ran dry, and dry shops meant customers walking to a competitor. The rhythm of Hudson Road was set by the rhythm of demand, and demand in the post-war years was ferocious. Britain was rebuilding. Men who'd spent 6 years in uniform wanted civilian suits. Men entering the workforce for the first time wanted to look the part. And Burton, 595 shops fed by the biggest clothing factory in the world, was ready to dress them all. The sound of the place was a layered thing. Not a single roar, but a weave of frequencies. The mechanical chatter of 9,000 sewing machines running simultaneously. The percussive hiss of the pressing irons. The low rumble of the conveyor systems moving cloth and garments between floors. And underneath it all, the murmur of conversation. Women talking to the machinist beside them. Not loudly, because you couldn't be loud over that noise, but steadily, in the continuous half-shouted, half-mouthed exchanges that factory workers develop when speech is a luxury the environment only half permits. It was a sound that followed you home. Former workers described it as a presence that took hours to leave your ears after a shift, a ringing absence that was, in its own way, the sound of the building refusing to let go of you. Chapter 5. A Life Inside the Gates. The women of Hudson Road didn't simply work at Burton's, they lived within its gravitational pull. The shift pattern structured the day, morning workers streaming through the gates in a tide that turned the surrounding streets into a moving crowd, the buses from Castleford and Normanton arriving on schedule, bicycles leaning in rows against walls that stretched further than most people's entire streets. Inside, the canteen, that colossal 8,000-seat canteen, served meals at prices subsidised by the company. Not free, but cheap enough that eating at work was the default for most of the workforce. The food was plain, institutional, cooked at a scale that prioritised volume over finesse. But it was hot, it was reliable, and for women whose household budgets were measured in shillings, a subsidised dinner at Burton's was money kept in the purse for rent and children and the 100 small expenses that working-class life generated without pause. Beyond the canteen, Burton's welfare apparatus operated like a parallel public service. The on-site doctor handled ailments that might otherwise have meant a trip to a GP. And a trip to a GP meant lost hours, lost wages, a complication in a life already organised to the minute. The dentist offered examinations and treatment that many of these women might not have sought independently, not from indifference to their own health, but from the arithmetic of poverty. Dental care cost money, and money had competing claims. Burton removed the arithmetic. The care was there, you used it. The eye examinations served the same function. For a machinist whose livelihood depended on close focus precision, threading needles, guiding fabric under a presser foot at speed, checking stitch lines against tolerances that the customer would never see, but the examiner certainly would. Deteriorating eyesight wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was an existential threat. Burton's decision to provide optical care on site wasn't philanthropy in the abstract. It was the maintenance of productive capacity, delivered in a form that also happened to improve the lives of the women who received it. And then there was the sunroom, a purpose-built space where workers could sit under lamps designed to simulate sunlight, a provision rooted in the interwar enthusiasm for heliotherapy, the medical belief that exposure to ultraviolet light could treat everything from rickets to tuberculosis to general malaise. The scientific basis was, by modern standards, incomplete. But the intent was real, and for women who spent their working hours inside a building so vast that natural light reached only the perimeter, the sunroom offered something that transcended its medical rationale. A break. A warm, bright space. A few minutes that felt different from the rhythm of the machine. This wasn't Eden. The work was repetitive, physically demanding, and conducted at a pace that didn't relent. The noise was punishing. The hierarchy was rigid. Supervisors monitored output, quality was enforced through inspection, and the gap between Burton's boardroom and the sewing machine floor was measured in class, gender, and power as much as in stories. Women who fell behind were noticed. Women who fell ill lost earnings. The welfare provisions existed within, not instead of. An industrial system designed to extract maximum output from every pair of hands on the premises. But, and this is the distinction that matters, the women of Hudson Road knew what other factories looked like. They knew what other employers offered, which was often nothing beyond the legal minimum. They knew that Burton's canteen, Burton's dentist, Burton's sunroom were not standard. They were exceptional. And that exceptionalism created a loyalty, a sense of belonging, that bound workers to the factory in ways that pure wages couldn't replicate. You didn't just work at Burton's. You were a Burton's woman. It meant something. It meant your teeth were looked after and your dinner was hot, and your employer, whatever his commercial motives, had arranged the world inside those gates so that your working life contained something more than labour. Multi-generational employment followed naturally. Mothers brought daughters. Sisters recruited sisters. The terraces around Bermontofts and Harehills became feeders for the factory in the way that pit villages fed collieries. Not through compulsion but through proximity, familiarity, and the simple economic logic that the best job within walking distance was the one your mother already had. Whole families moved through Hudson Road across decades, their working lives layered onto the same floors, the same machines, the same canteen seats. The recreational facilities extended the factory's reach into time that should have been the workers' own. Bowling greens, cricket pitches, tennis courts, social clubs. The Leeds Civic Trust records describe a site designed around the total rhythm of a life, not just the hours between clocking in and clocking out, but the hours before and after, the weekends, the summers. Burton had built a world, and that world was self-contained enough that a woman could wake in a Burton-adjacent terrace, ride a Burton bus, eat a Burton meal, see a Burton dentist, play on a Burton bowling green, and walk home through streets whose every second household contained another Burton employee. It was welfare capitalism at its most comprehensive. It was also, by its nature, a form of enclosure. The benevolence was real. The dependency it created was also real. And when the time came for that world to be dismantled, when the decisions made in boardrooms far from Hudson Road concluded that making suits in Leeds was no longer the most efficient use of capital, the women who'd built their lives inside those gates would discover that the loyalty Burton had cultivated didn't flow in both directions. Chapter 6. The Summit and its Shadow. By the mid-1950s, Burton's empire had achieved something that even its founder might have struggled to imagine from his Chesterfield shopfront half a century earlier. Nearly 600 shops on British high streets, each one bearing those distinctive Art Deco facades. A factory in Leeds producing 30,000 suits a week. A workforce numbering in the tens of thousands across the company. A brand so embedded in the national consciousness that going to Burton's had become a phrase, not a brand name spoken aloud, but a verb, an activity, a rite of passage for young men buying their first proper suit. Montague Burton himself didn't live to see the full summit. He died in 1952, aged 67, the Lithuanian boy who'd arrived with nothing, who'd changed his name and built a factory city, who'd fed 8,000 workers in a single room, gone before the story turned. His twin sons, Arnold and Raymond Burton, inherited a business that appeared indestructible. The shops were profitable. The factory was running. The model, make the suits in Leeds, sell them everywhere, was proven across decades and a world war. And yet, stand inside Hudson Road in 1955 and everything looks permanent. The machines are running. The canteen is full. The buses from Castleford are still arriving on schedule. But pull back. Look at the wider picture, the one that nobody inside those gates had any reason to examine, and the landscape is already shifting beneath the foundation. Britain's textile industry was entering a period of contraction that would, over the next 3 decades, reduce it from a dominant employer to a marginal one. Cheaper imports were arriving from countries where labour costs were a fraction of British rates. Consumer habits were changing. Younger men, the generation that would define the 1960s, weren't interested in made-to-measure suits from their father's tailor. They wanted ready-to-wear. They wanted fashion. They wanted to look different from their dads, not identical to them. Burton's model, the whole magnificent vertically integrated engine of shops and factory and welfare and buses, had been built on a specific proposition. Working men wanted well-fitting suits, and Burton would make them affordably at enormous scale. But what happened when working men stopped wanting suits? What happened when the customer changed, and the factory couldn't change with them? These questions weren't being asked at Hudson Road. Not yet. The production lines were full. The order books were healthy. The welfare facilities were still running. The sunroom was still warm. But Montague Burton was dead. The man who'd built the system, who understood its logic from the inside because he'd invented every piece of it, was gone. And the people who would inherit his decisions, the managers, the board members, the eventual new owners, would look at Hudson Road and see something very different from what Burton had seen. He'd seen a community. They would see a cost. The machinery was still running. The canteen was still serving 8,000 meals. The women were still arriving through the gates in the same morning tide that had flowed for decades. But the summit, by its nature, is the point after which every step leads down. Chapter 7. The world turns cheaper. The forces that would undo Hudson Road didn't arrive as a single catastrophe. They gathered slowly across decades in places far from Leeds. In government offices debating trade policy, in Asian textile towns where a machinist's daily wage was less than a Burton's woman earned before her morning tea break, and in boardrooms where men who'd never threaded a needle studied spreadsheets and saw a number they didn't like. Britain in the 1970s was a country under economic siege. The oil shock of 1973 drove inflation to levels that punished every industry dependent on energy, transport, and raw materials, which meant, in practice, every industry. Unemployment climbed. The IMF arrived in 1976, a humiliation that told the world Britain's post-war economic settlement was broken. And in the textile and clothing sectors, industries already vulnerable to competition from countries where labour was cheaper by orders of magnitude, the pressure was existential. Parliamentary debate from 1980 laid the scale of the threat on the record. Clothing and textiles still employed hundreds of thousands across Britain, but the redundancy waves were already moving. Factories that had operated for generations were closing, not because they'd forgotten how to make things, but because making things in Britain now cost more than making them somewhere else. The arithmetic was brutal, and for anyone willing to look at it honestly, unanswerable within the existing model. A machinist in Leeds cost what a machinist in Leeds cost. A machinist in Bangladesh cost a fraction of that. And the cloth didn't care whose hands stitched it. Burton's specific vulnerability was structural as well as economic. The company had been built as a vertically integrated operation, factory and shops locked together in a single system, each dependent on the other. That integration had been the source of Burton's power. Control the making, control the quality, control the customer experience from cloth to fitting room. But vertical integration works only as long as every link in the chain is competitive. The moment one link, manufacturing, became significantly more expensive than the alternatives, the whole chain was under strain. Inside Hudson Road, the strain showed physically. The vast production floors that had once hummed with 9,000 machinists began to thin. Not overnight, decline rarely announces itself with a single morning, but incrementally. Shifts shortened, departments consolidated, women who left weren't always replaced. The buses from Castleford still ran, but they carried fewer passengers. The canteen still served meals, but the empty seats multiplied, quietly, the way empty seats always multiply in places that are contracting. One here, two there, a whole table, then a whole row. The external threat had a domestic political dimension that the documentary must acknowledge without prosecuting. The Conservative government elected in 1979 pursued an economic programme built on the conviction that British industry had to become competitive or be allowed to fail. Subsidies were cut. Protections were reduced. The market, not the state, would determine which factories survived. For industries like clothing, labour-intensive, geographically concentrated, deeply woven into the social fabric of specific communities, this was not an abstract policy position. It was a verdict. And the communities that heard it understood exactly what it meant. Burton's leadership understood it too, and their response would reshape the company beyond recognition. Chapter 8. The Spreadsheet Wins. The man who would dismantle Montague Burton's manufacturing legacy was, by the standards of British retail, a success story. Ralph Halpern, later Sir Ralph Halpern, arrived at Burton Group with a reputation for commercial sharpness and a diagnosis that was, by the numbers, difficult to argue with. Burton, he concluded, had fallen behind. Other British clothing retailers were leaner, faster, more responsive to consumer fashion. Burton was still running an industrial-age model, making its own suits in its own factory, while the market had moved towards sourcing, branding, and retail theatre. The factory was, in Halpern's analysis, an anchor, and anchors, in a rising tide, are useful. In a storm, they drown you. His chairman's report of December 1981 laid out the strategy in language that left little room for misunderstanding. First, the curtailing of the company's manufacturing activity. Second, the application of Topshop's retail methods across the wider group. Third, the shedding of loss-making activities. The word curtailing is worth pausing on, not because it's euphemistic, though it is, but because of what it describes. The floors of Hudson Road, where 9,000 women had once stitched 30,000 suits a week, were to be reduced, repurposed, and ultimately abandoned. The making was to stop. The selling would continue. Halpin's logic was rooted in a real problem. Burton had diversified menswear, women's wear, mail order, leisure equipment, photographic supplies, and the diversifications had spread the company thin. The solution, as Halpin saw it, was to concentrate on what the market rewarded, which was retail. Not making, selling, branding, the shop window, not the sewing machine. And so the transformation began. Top Shop. The chain that would become Arcadia's most visible brand was used as a template. Its methods of rapid stock turnover, trend responsiveness, and high street visual impact were exported across the group. Burton wasn't going to be a manufacturer that also ran shops. It was going to be a retailer that happened, for now, to still own a factory. The consequences arrived at Hudson Road in stages that the workforce experienced as a slow amputation. Production lines were shut down, not all at once, but department by department, floor by floor. The vast open spaces that had been designed for the continuous flow of cloth, receiving to cutting to machining to pressing to finishing, were carved into smaller rooms. Partition walls went up where production lines had run. The building was being repurposed from the inside out, its manufacturing identity overwritten by distribution, warehousing, office space. The suits were still being sold in the shops. They just weren't being made here anymore. By 1991, the process was complete. Company history records that Burton Group had shed all its cloth and clothing. Manufacturing activities. Every last one. The factory that Montague Burton had built to make 30,000 suits a week. The factory with the 8,000-seat canteen and the sunroom and the dental chairs and the bowling green no longer made anything at all. The women who'd powered the operation, the machinists whose hands had moved too fast for cameras to follow, the pressers who'd worked in steam so thick it clung to their skin, the examiners whose eyes had caught faults invisible to anyone else, were gone. Redundancy. That British word that softens the blow by making it sound administrative. You haven't been sacked. You've been made redundant. Your skills, your experience, your 30 years of muscle memory, they're redundant. The company no longer requires them. What the company required now was shelf space, logistics, and a supply chain that stretched to wherever in the world the cost per garment was lowest. The suits would still carry the Burton name. They would still hang in Burton shops. But the hands that made them would belong to someone else, somewhere else, in a country whose machinists earned in a day what a Hudson Road woman had earned in an hour. The management decisions that preceded and accompanied Halpin's restructuring deserve their own moment. The Jacobson influence, Sidney and Lionel Jacobson, who entered the Burton orbit through the 1953 acquisition of Jackson the Tailor and its associated weaver-to-wearer brand, had already shifted the company's centre of gravity away from making and toward trading. The Jacobsons brought professional retail management into a firm that had been, under its founder, a manufacturing enterprise with shops attached. They strengthened the commercial instincts. They professionalised the buying. And they made the divestment of cloth-making not just thinkable, but logical, a process of capital reallocation that any business school would have endorsed. Each of these decisions, Halpin's curtailment, the Jacobson-era pivot toward trading, the steady conversion of Hudson Road from factory to warehouse, made sense on its own terms. Each one answered a real problem with a defensible solution, and each one moved the company further from the thing that Montague Burton had understood in his bones. That making the product yourself was not a cost to be eliminated. It was the foundation on which everything else stood. Remove the foundation and the building doesn't fall immediately. It stands for a while, apparently stable, apparently fine, but it's standing on nothing. And when the next storm arrives, there's nothing underneath to hold it up. Chapter 9. The Greens arrive. The storm had a name. Several names, in fact. But the one that would become synonymous with the final destruction of the Burton Empire was Philip Green. Green acquired Arcadia Group, the corporate entity that Burton Group had become, a portfolio of high street retail chains, including Burton, Dorothy Perkins, Wallace, Miss Selfridge, and the crown jewel, Topshop, in 2002 for £850 million. The deal was structured through Taveta Investments, a holding company controlled by Green's wife, Lady Tina Green, who was domiciled in Monaco. That detail, Monaco, not London, Lady Green, not Sir Philip, would prove important later, when the questions about money, tax, and moral responsibility began to accumulate. What Green bought was a collection of brands with a combined high street presence of hundreds of shops and tens of thousands of employees. What he did not buy, because it no longer existed, was any manufacturing capacity whatsoever. The suits, the dresses, the jeans, all of it was sourced from external suppliers, many of them in Bangladesh, Myanmar, Turkey, and other countries where production costs were low and regulatory oversight was variable. The supply chain that connected a Burton label to a factory floor now stretched across continents, and the workers at the far end of it had no connection to Leeds, no dental care, no sunroom, no subsidised canteen. Green's management style was, by multiple accounts, direct, confrontational, and focused on cash generation. And in 2005, Arcadia generated cash on a scale that made front pages. RTE reported that Green paid himself, or more precisely, paid Taveta, and therefore Lady Green, a dividend of £1.2 billion. £1.2 billion. From a group of high street clothing shops. That number hangs in the air and doesn't settle, because it raises a question that the subsequent decade would make unavoidable. Where does £1.2 billion in dividends come from, when the shops they're drawn from will later be unable to meet their pension obligations? The answer is structural. A dividend is drawn from accumulated profits, and, in some corporate structures, from the value of assets that can be leveraged or liquidated. Green had acquired Arcadia during a period when its brands, particularly Topshop, which under creative director Jane Shepherdson had become a genuinely influential fashion force, were generating strong revenues. The dividend wasn't illegal. It wasn't by the strict letter of corporate law, even irregular. It was what the structure permitted. But it was also, in retrospect, the moment when the last residue of Montague Burton's social contract, the idea that a company owed something beyond shareholder return to the people whose labour generated its profits, was formally extinguished. Burton had fed his workers, examined their teeth, bathed them in simulated sunlight. Green extracted £1.2 billion and parked it in Monaco. Chapter 10. Deferred pay on fire. The pension deficit was the slow-burning consequence that nobody outside the actuarial tables was watching closely enough. A company pension is not a gift. It is deferred pay, wages earned today, held in trust, and returned to the worker after retirement. When a company underfunds its pension scheme, it is, in effect, borrowing from its own workers' futures. And when the deficit between what the scheme owes and what the scheme holds grows large enough, the future becomes a place where promises can't be kept. By 2019, the Arcadia pension scheme deficit had reached a scale that triggered parliamentary scrutiny. The Work and Pensions Committee examined the numbers and found a hole. Estimates ranged from £537 million to £727 million. £500 million to £727 million. That's not a shortfall. That's a crater, carved into decades of accumulated retirement promises made to workers who'd been told, implicitly and explicitly, that their pension was secure. The committee's inquiry laid out the guarantees that Arcadia and the Green family had offered to the pensions regulator during the company's CVA process. £75 million over 3 years. £210 million in security from Arcadia and its subsidiaries. £100 million in cash from Lady Green. The committee also discussed the regulator's ability to pursue assets held overseas, a polite parliamentary way of acknowledging that the wealth extracted from Arcadia had been structured, through Tveta and Monaco residency in a way that put it beyond easy domestic reach. For the workers whose retirement income depended on a scheme with a deficit measured in hundreds of millions, the parliamentary hearings were a lesson in how power operates across borders. The labour had been performed in Leeds, in shops across Britain, in supply chain factories across Asia. The profits had been extracted in London. The dividends had landed in Monaco. And the pension deficit, the unpaid promise, the deferred wages that would now never be fully honoured, sat in the gap between what had been taken out and what had been left behind. The BHS precedent made the Burton pension story feel not like an anomaly, but like a pattern. BHS, sold by Green in 2015 to Dominic Chappell for £1, collapsed the following year, leaving a pension deficit of over 500 million and a workforce of 11,000 facing redundancy. The parliamentary report on BHS was one of the most damning documents ever produced about a British corporate failure. MPS concluded that what had happened amounted to systematic plunder, leadership failures compounded by personal greed, and assets stripped and disposed of to a buyer whom the committee judged unsuitable, with pension obligations treated as someone else's problem. Frank Field, the MP who chaired the joint inquiry, delivered a verdict that entered the public record as something close to a moral indictment. His words were quoted in coverage that made BHS a shorthand for a particular kind of British corporate failure, the kind where the wealth travels upward and the consequences travel down. Arcadia was not BHS. The legal structures were different. The timeline was different. But the workers watching the pension hearings, the people whose deferred wages sat inside that £500 million hole, could see the pattern. The company that had once provided dental care and a sunroom was now presiding over a pension scheme whose deficit exceeded the value of the dividend that had been extracted in a single year. Chapter 11. The stitching moves east. If the pension deficit was the wound that bled inward, the outsourced supply chain was the wound that bled outward, across oceans, into communities whose names most Burton customers would never learn. By the time Arcadia entered its final years, the garments sold under the Burton label, and under Topshop, Dorothy Perkins, Wallace, Miss Selfridge, and the group's other brands, were manufactured overwhelmingly in countries where labour was cheap, regulations were lighter, and the relationship between the brand on the label and the workers who made the garment was mediated by layers of intermediaries, agents, and subcontractors. The distance between the shop and the sewing machine, which at Hudson Road had been measured in corridors, was now measured in continents. When Arcadia collapsed, that distance became a moral chasm. Mostafiz Uddin owned Denim Expert Limited, a factory in Chittagong, Bangladesh. He made jeans. Some of them carried labels that connected, through the supply chain, to Arcadia's brands. And in 2020, when the orders stopped, cancelled, delayed, disputed, Uddin told The Independent that he could close within days. 2,000 workers, he said, faced destitution, not redundancy. Destitution. The word carries a different weight when spoken by someone in Chittagong than when spoken by someone in Westminster. The Bangladesh Garment Manufacturers and Exporters Association provided the wider picture. Arcadia had cancelled approximately £9 million of orders in Bangladesh alone. The Worker Rights Consortium estimated total global cancellations at as much as £100 million. Orders placed, fabric cut, production begun. And then the buyer, the brand, the name on the label, the company in London, walked away. The garments existed. The labour had been performed. The wages were owed. But the money wasn't coming. Arcadia's position, as reported at the time, was that many of these orders had been placed through intermediaries, not directly, and that the company's legal obligations were therefore less clear than the suppliers claimed. This was structurally accurate. The layers of mediation that defined modern fashion supply chains existed in part precisely to create this ambiguity. Suffering was immediate and local. Responsibility was diffused and contractual. A factory owner in Chittagong could describe his workers' desperation in vivid human terms. The corporate response arrived in the language of legal relationships and commercial structures. Uddin's own words, reported in The Independent, described the experience in terms that cut through the legalese. He said it felt as though someone was stealing his company day by day. Not quickly, not violently, but steadily, through the withdrawal of payment for work already completed. The slow bleed of a business built on trust in a system that had decided trust was no longer commercially necessary. Montague Burton had built a factory where the women who made his suits ate in his canteen, saw his dentist, sat in his sunroom. The company that inherited his name had built a supply chain where the women who made its jeans couldn't get paid for the work they'd already done. Chapter 12. Administration Night. On the 30th of November 2020, Arcadia Group entered administration. Deloitte were appointed as administrators. Around 13,000 jobs were at risk. The date matters because of what surrounded it. Britain was deep in its second COVID lockdown. High streets were closed, shops were shuttered. The pandemic had accelerated a decline in physical retail that had been gathering for years, compressing what might have been a slow unwinding into a sudden stop. Arcadia, already weakened by debt, dividend extraction, pension obligations, and a business model that depended on footfall through physical doors, didn't survive the compression. 13,000 jobs. Say it slowly. 13,000 people who woke up that morning employed and went to bed that night uncertain. Shop assistants, warehouse workers, regional managers, head office staff, the full spectrum of a retail operation that had once, in a different form and under a different name, employed 10,000 people in a single Leeds factory. The administration triggered the final breakup. And the breakup revealed, with uncomfortable clarity, where the value in a modern retail empire actually sits. ASOS, the online fashion retailer, acquired Topshop, Topman, Miss Selfridge and the activewear brand High Tees 8 for £265 million, plus additional payments for stock. The deal transferred approximately 300 employees. Not the stores, not the leases, not the shop assistants who'd sold the clothes or the cleaners who'd mopped the floors. 300 people, mostly in design, buying and digital. The intellectual infrastructure. The rest were left behind. Boohoo acquired Burton, Dorothy Perkins and Wallace for £25.2 million. Again, the brands, the digital assets, the intellectual property. Not the shops, not the people who worked in them. 25.2 million. For the name Montague Burton had built from nothing. For the brand that had dressed millions of British men, that had once meant 600 shopfronts and a factory city in Leeds. 25.2 million, and the shops could close and the staff could go and the name would float free, untethered from any physical place, any tangible workforce, any canteen or dentist's chair or sunroom. 265 million for Topshop. 25 million for Burton. The gap between those numbers tells you which name still had currency and which had become, in the language of asset valuation, a catalogue entry. Both were stripped of their physical existence. Both were rendered digital. But one was worth 10 times the other, because one still meant something to a 22-year-old with a phone, and the other meant something only to people old enough to remember what it had been. Chapter 13. Montague Place. The factory is still there. That's the strange part. Hudson Road still stands, not as a ruin, not as a demolition site, but as a building in transition. A thing being turned into something else. The redevelopment plans describe what's coming. Housing, primarily. The site that once employed 10,000 people making 30,000 suits a week is being reimagined as a residential neighbourhood. The working title, Montague Place, carries the founder's name forward into a context he couldn't have imagined. Not a factory, not a shopfront, a postcode. The heritage strategy, documented in Leeds Civic Trust communications and developer proposals, promises to retain elements of the building's industrial identity. Art Deco motifs preserved in new facades. Iconic Burton signage panels incorporated into the development. Architectural gestures toward a history that the buildings themselves are being repurposed to forget. Leeds Civic Trust argued for more than gestures. Their planning suggestions called for the retention of principal factory elevations, the external walls that gave Hudson Road its physical identity, and for the creation of a publicly accessible Burton archive. A space where the records, the photographs, the films, the wage slips, the welfare inspection books, the canteen menus could be gathered and made available. An admission, implicit in the ask, that without deliberate intervention the place would become heritage wallpaper. The appearance of memory without the substance. Arnold Burton and Raymond Burton, Montague's twin sons, had been present when a blue plaque was unveiled at Hudson Road on the 30th of March 2001, commemorating their father's achievement. A small bronze disc on a wall. The factory was already long emptied of its original purpose by then. The plaque honoured what had been, not what was. Now the building itself is being rewritten. The corridors where cloth once moved from receiving to cutting to machining are becoming corridors between flats. The canteen that seated 8,000, if it survives at all, will survive as a reference, a heritage note in an architect's brief, a sentence in a planning document that most residents will never read. The women are gone. The machinists, the pressers, the finishers, the examiners. They left when the production lines closed, and they took with them a body of skill and knowledge that no archive can fully preserve. You can photograph a sewing machine. You can film the building. You can preserve the signage. But you cannot preserve the speed of a woman's hands guiding fabric under a presser foot at a pace that cameras struggle to capture. You cannot preserve the particular way 9,000 people moved through a single building in a single morning. The tide of them, the sound of them, the knowledge held collectively in their fingers. What survives are traces. The blue plaque. The film archive footage. The planning documents that argue, politely, for the retention of facades. The name Montague Place, which carries the founder's identity into a future where nobody will stitch anything within its boundaries. Chapter 14. What the Loom Remembers. A 15-year-old boy arrives in a country whose language he doesn't speak. He changes his name. He opens a shop. He builds a factory so large that the canteen seats 8,000. He provides dental care, eye examinations, simulated sunlight. He employs 10,000 people, 9,000 of them women, and produces 30,000 suits every week in a building that the enemy marks for bombing because it matters that much. He dies. And the people who inherit what he built look at it and see something different from what he saw. They see cost where he saw community. They see inefficiency where he saw dignity. They see a manufacturing operation in a country where manufacturing has become expensive, and they make the calculations that the numbers demand, and floor by floor, department by department, the making stops. The making stops, but the selling continues. The name survives. The shops survive. For a while. And then new owners arrive, and the name becomes a vehicle for extraction. Dividends measured in billions, pensions measured in deficits, supply chains stretched so far that the women who stitch the garments can't get paid for the work they've already done. Then the shops close. The brands are sold. The digital assets transfer. The name floats free. And on Hudson Road, in a building that once breathed with the rhythm of 30,000 suits a week, the developers arrive with their heritage strategies and their Art Deco motifs and their plans for flats where the cutting room used to be. The women of Hudson Road, Shamat, the 9,000 whose hands made the empire, are not in the planning documents. They're not in the asset valuations. They're not in the brand equity that ASOS paid $265 million for, or the $25 million that Boohoo paid for the Burton name itself. They're in the archives, if you look. In the film archive footage, if you watch. In the memories of families in Bermontofts and Harehills and Castleford, if you ask. And in the building, still there, still standing, being turned into something else.